Hi, and welcome back to Blockchain Fundamentals with Bill Laboon. Today, we're going to discuss cryptocurrency and anonymity. And specifically, I want to discuss what we really mean when we say that something can be anonymous, and what sort of technologies can help make blockchain transactions more anonymous, and even why we would want to do so in the first place. So once again, we will be using Bitcoin as sort of the standard for how we discuss how these are implemented. But I will mention a few other chains at the end of this and their approaches to anonymity. So it will not be entirely focused on Bitcoin. So the first thing we really should ask ourselves when we ask if something is anonymous is, what do we mean by anonymous? Not to sound too pedantic, and I realize I do sound a little bit like that. The word comes from the Greek "an" without an onoma, name. So if we mean by anonymity that you can use Bitcoin without using your real name, then yes, it is anonymous. But if we mean no, you can use no name at all, that's false. You will have some equivalent of your name, specifically your address. So generally, when we speak of using Bitcoin, we say that it is not anonymous, but rather pseudonymous. Also from the Greek, just using pseudus for false. So we have a false name. It's very easy for you to create one or more identities on Bitcoin. You simply create a new address. And this creating an address is very simple. It can be done in a fraction of a second on any modern computer. And so it's extremely simple also to have multiple identities. So you don't have to maintain the same identity, but you will always have to have some identity on the blockchain. And in some sense, your identity on the blockchain is more permanent than any identity that you use in real life. Assuming that Bitcoin continues to be used, then the blockchain will always exist, the Bitcoin blockchain. And so if the blockchain exists, all of the transactions and all of the identities will continue to be on here and are trivial to look up. And if you consider this in terms of a transaction in real life, perhaps if I go into a coffee shop this morning, when they write down your name on the cup to call out, Bill or Lil or Jill, since they often get my name wrong, then yes, they know perhaps your true name there, but everybody is going to forget it. It's perhaps already by now they have forgotten it. It's not written down anywhere but the cup, but on the blockchain. So even though you are using a pseudonym, that data is around permanently. Which means that you can use, people can use some de-anonymization techniques to match that pseudonym with your real life identity. So when we talk about anonymity, we mean something stronger than Bitcoin's pseudonymity. A lot of people discovered, to their chagrin, in the early days, Bitcoin was really seen as anonymous money, and they discovered that, in fact, no, anything on the blockchain is quite trackable. And so a lot of people who were using Bitcoin for purposes that were against the law of the country they were operating in ended up finding out that they actually could be tracked down. They were not really anonymous. So from a technical perspective, when we talk about anonymity on the blockchain, we do mean a pseudonymous system. You should be able to use new identities. But additionally, we are also looking for unlinkability. That means that these individual interactions should not be traceable to a single identity. So this is nothing more than what you would get if you think about it with cash. that if I get whatever 50 $1 bills, and I use $1 bill to get a Coke, and then a few days later I use some other dollar bills to buy some candy. There is no way for people to track me down and say, wow, that Bill really has a sweet tooth since he is drinking soda and buying candy. They can't link those two transactions together to get more information about me, which using Bitcoin, there are some difficulties with that, because tracking the reality, the state of the system, requires understanding every transaction really that has occurred on it. So why do we want anonymity, besides making sure that people don't know how much candy that I buy? Well, first, our first motivation, our goal really, if you look back to the Bitcoin white paper, is just to have sort of the same peer-to-peer electronic cash. We want to have at least the level of privacy at a very minimum that you use when using a credit card. So some others may have access to your transaction history, but most people don't. If I use my credit card to buy, so I just bought 4 boxes of cookies, my bank may have some questions for me, perhaps. Maybe if I bought 1,000 boxes of cookies, my bank may have questions for me. But my child can't see it and ask, where you bought 1,000 boxes of cookies. I should get at least 20 of those. My wife can't see it and say, why are you spending all of our money on cookies, etc. So this is like a baseline level of privacy. Can we, while having everything out in the open on the blockchain, can we have this small level of privacy? But ideally, we want this second level of true anonymity and make it really infeasible for anyone to track the participants in a transaction. So I want to go on a little segue or a tangent here, I guess, that given enough computing power and resources and time, it's generally possible to remove and de-anonymize people's transactions. Now, this amount of time may be infeasible. It may take as long as the end of the universe in order to crack a code, but there are what we would call side-channel attacks. There are other ways to do this. Just to take an ad absurdum example, imagine that everybody in the entire world is trying to break your privacy. They could be following you. They could be sending in fake data into your computer. They could be replacing your computer when you get up. Just imagine an adversary with essentially unlimited power. They would probably be able to de-anonymize you. And so that's why we say it's computationally infeasible. So for the attack threats, for the threats that an ordinary person would face, or even perhaps someone who may be targeted by state or non-state actors, like large actors, can we make it computationally infeasible to de-anonymize? And that brings us to another question. What are the ethics of this? At first blush, one might think anonymity is a good thing. At least in the United States and a lot of other places, most people don't want their coworkers to know their salary. If you're running a business, you don't want your competitors to know who your suppliers are, right? By seeing who you're paying on the blockchain. Or if you're being paid in Bitcoin, seeing how much your boss is paying you. You may want political privacy. So you may belong to a political party which is not approved of by the current system, and so you want to be able to send them political contributions quietly without it being known. Or non-governmental organizations, if you want to send money to Greenpeace, for instance, or some other controversial NGO, then you may not want people to know about this. But on the other hand, we can use anonymous currency in other ways. I don't want to get too deep into whether or not these particular things are ethical, but they're certainly illegal. And if you think unethical implies illegal or vice versa, well, there you go. But certainly we could use anonymous currency to do things that the vast majority of people would disapprove of, such as ransomware or blackmail, all of these things that we then would have no real backup to determine or to blacklist these people if we have truly anonymous money. Of course, we already have that with cash, although that's difficult to deal with on a high level, and there are some ways to de-anonymize cash, such as serial numbers. So there has been an idea, and we've seen this in the United States quite often, about sort of can we implement this technology so people can have the benefits of anonymity, but make sure that they only have anonymity as long as they're doing good things with it. So can we just have like a key that the police have, and generally people have anonymity, but if you have this police key, then your encryption could be broken. It turns out that there's no real way to do this. Even if we want to be decentralized, we certainly can't have parties that sort of a priori have more power in the system, such as in this case the police. We'd have some central arbiter to determine the good and bad use cases. So there's an old saying that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And I think this is the situation. If we want to have a decentralized system, we can't say, we can't have some subjective arbiter that would say that, oh, right, this is a person, well, they're obviously a terrorist and we should break their encryption, versus, oh, no, they're good, they're fighting for their freedom against a tyrannical government, and so we should let them continue to use encryption tools. So if you want to be decentralized, you have to take the good with the bad. And even from a technical level, leaving that like a possible key or a weakness in the encryption, that means that that's something that a bad, quote unquote bad guy could potentially find. In order to do this, you have to weaken the encryption. And I think it's really key to realize that a good and a bad use case, just like our terrorist and freedom fighter example, they look the same from the point of view of the technology. From the point of view of Bitcoin, it doesn't know if you're buying alpaca wool slippers or you are paying a ransom because someone infected your computers and encrypted them. In those computers, they didn't know that were infected. They didn't know if they were being encrypted because we want to protect the data on it, or if they're being used as part of a ransom attack. So if we want to have the benefits of encryption, we need to understand that this goes both ways, right? The use of cryptocurrency goes both ways. And so it becomes a sort of personal ethical question, what you do with it, as opposed to a legal question of what can be done with it. But I think there's no doubt that having this information out there, right, especially in regards to strong encryption and cryptography, weakens the power of the state in this particular realm. Being able to communicate without being eavesdropped upon, well, this is a real power of most state systems. And so by removing that or making it more difficult for them, this has made some weakness in there. And with Bitcoin, what I think is really interesting is that money is now a form of communication. You can send value in terms of communication. In the old days, 50 years ago or 70 years ago, maybe, you couldn't send a group of numbers over, call somebody up on the telephone or on the, make an announcement on the wireless and send some numbers and have people accept money. Now, obviously, there have been some centralized ways of doing that, like credit cards, where you could tell people your credit card number and buy something. But this ability to communicate and do it in a sort of stateless way, and not stateless in the computer science form of the word, but in the political science form of the word, has led to a movement called Crypto-anarchy. So that I recommend you look into this. It's very important in the history of the development of cryptocurrency, and I think looking at the background of where cryptocurrency comes from gives you a really good idea of where we are now. So the idea of crypto-anarchy is that by having this space that is really free from government overreach, or reach, depends on your definition, then we can really develop, the people doing that can develop their own concept of a society outside of the concept of a government. So it's very interesting. I'll have the links that you can look up on the comments in the course. So is pseudonymity enough for us? So it may be. You may be fine with just sort of that, remember that first level of privacy, where perhaps state actors could track you down, but most people looking at the Bitcoin blockchain will not be able to tell who owned what Bitcoin and what the transaction was spent upon. However, anyone who is interested in maintaining a sense of privacy should realize blockchain is public, and if there's ever a place where your real identity is linked to an address you used, well, now you have been very easily de-anonymized, and they can then trace where the Bitcoin go. There are a lot of different ways to do this, and it turns out it is very difficult to avoid leaking information about yourself. So we'll talk about some of these ways, but if you think about just how many times that you have, using a computer, you have given away your information. And if that computer can be linked with a Bitcoin transaction, well, then there you go. There's a connection. Okay, so just to sort of summarize Bitcoin and the state of that, it's pseudonymous, not anonymous. And we're operating in this lecture on the assumption that anonymity, so that's pseudonymity plus unlinkability, not being able to link two transactions together, is good. It is trivial for anyone to follow transactions on the blockchain. They are easily available. There are tens of thousands of copies, if not more, of the Bitcoin blockchain, and it's very easy to verify. But what we can do is make some steps to improve anonymity. So, how do we do that? In our ideal world of unlinkability, there's really three things that we want. So for the same user, it should be hard, computationally difficult. Remember again, if you have the powers of the entire universe behind you, many of these things are possible. But we want to make it hard or computationally infeasible to do these things. So it should be hard to link together different addresses of the same user. The same user should be able to have multiple accounts, and it's difficult to link them all together. For the same user, it should be hard to link their transactions together and know that they're from the same user. And finally, it should be hard to link the sender of the payment to the recipient of the payment. So we should not be able to see that person X is sending and person Y is receiving. However, there are a lot of things we need to worry about in terms of avoiding de-anonymization. So this ideal world, this unlinkability, even if we had a blockchain that didn't provide a lot of this information, there's constant leakage of your data into the world. So these are not on-chain leakages of like extra information being put on the blockchain, but simply by virtue of using Bitcoin, you are leaking information. So for instance, if you go to pay with Bitcoin at a coffee shop, remember I said they forgot my name, but if they were a spy that was waiting for me, then certainly they recorded, okay, we just saw a Bitcoin transaction come through to our address from this person, and this person paid for it. He's the only one that we gave this address to. Well, now we know that Bill Laboon has some Bitcoin at this particular address, and that can help de-anonymize me. Analysis of usage times. So if I see that someone is very active from 6 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time to 4 p.m. for instance, well, it's very unlikely that I live in Japan or China. Right? Or maybe that I'm just awake at night all the time, but it's unlikely. Reusing addresses, posting addresses, letting people know off-chain what your address is. Anytime you do that, you're linking yourself to it. But of course, using Bitcoin, you need to say your address. Perhaps if you made a vanity address, and remember we discussed these in a previous lecture, and maybe there's a special meaning behind it. So for instance, you'll remember the vanity address I made was for CS1699, which was a class that I taught. So people can then see, all right, who's somebody that taught a class called CS1699? They see that a Bill Laboon taught a class on this, which was also called Cryptocurrency and Blockchain Technology. Well, that gives them a good idea that it might be me. So these are just some examples. There's a lot of ways that de-anonymization can occur. So getting back to our earlier slide here, and so just after saying that it's difficult, we want to have unlinkability. And while there are some ways of avoiding 1 and 2, it turns out it's very difficult to avoid number 3, especially in a entirely transparent system like a Bitcoin-style blockchain. So what we can do, though, is just hide the transaction in with a bunch of others. So we are going to need to say that A is sending something and B is receiving it, but if there's 100 A's and 100 B's, well, we don't know where exactly it's going. Okay, so we know A is sending something, we know B is receiving something, but we don't know if B is receiving it from R or X or Z, and we don't know if A is sending it to Q or L or J. Okay? So what we are doing here is increasing the size of what we call the anonymity set. So this is the set of transactions that an adversary can't distinguish from your actual transaction. And the larger this is, the harder it's going to be to track down. So if your adversary knows, for instance, that you own address A, they're going to see that address A sent something, but they're not going to know where it went to. Okay? And you could even use this to send it back to yourself. Maybe a second address is A prime. So they may think you don't have any Bitcoins anymore, but you've really just sent them to a different address. So I like to think of this as the cicada strategy. So if you've never seen cicadas, they come out of the ground, at least the broods near Baltimore where I was living. See, I just leaked some information about myself there. Every 17 years. And cicadas they have no defenses, they have no way of protecting themselves whatsoever. Turtles catch them and eat them, they can't fly very well, but there are millions of them, millions and millions and millions of them. And there's no way, and they all come out of the ground at once. It's actually a quite awe-inspiring sight. Over the course of a day or two, these millions of insects come out of the ground and make a huge noise. So, sure, there's they don't have a lot of protections, but because there are just so many of them, it's hard to find any particular one. right? And so, yeah, sure, lots get eaten, but lots also survive. So in this case, there's no being eaten, but there is the fact that there's just so many that if you say, well, I'm looking for a particular cicada, you're never going to find it. Okay. So I want to say that the anonymity set is not one number. So different adversaries that are reviewing this may have more motivation or skills or different knowledge. They may know, for instance, that X, Y, and Z addresses are already being used by someone else, so you're not sending to them, or maybe their address is X, Y, and Z. So the anonymity set, we can have a good idea of it, but depending on the adversary who's trying to de-anonymize you, you can never know exactly how large, the anonymity set is. So in order to really calculate, or at least estimate, we need to figure out what does the adversary definitely know? What do they trivially know just by looking at the blockchain? What does the adversary probably not know? Right? So, for instance, they may they probably don't know all of the users. If you have an anonymity set of 100 different addresses, they probably don't know the people behind all of them, and what the adversary cannot know. So there are things they cannot know, such as your private key, or at least essentially cannot know. Again, if you've got millions of hidden cameras in your room watching you all the time, and people are using Tempest equipment to spy on your monitor, okay, perhaps in that case there's nothing they truly cannot know. But again, generally we're looking in terms of what the kind of adversary we're facing off against can do. And we generally don't think that the entire world is against us and involved in a vast Illuminati-like conspiracy. Okay, something else that we can use here, so besides, and something to avoid, is a taint analysis. So this is something that was much bigger in the early days of Bitcoin. We don't see it as much because we have realized as a community to avoid address reuse if you're interested in privacy. So taint analysis asks, how related are two Bitcoin identities? So if we have some coins from S and they always end up in R at some point, so even if they happen to go through intermediaries, then they're going to have a high taint score. So we're looking just for how often are these different addresses involved in similar transactions. Okay? Do coins from one always end up in the other, or vice versa? So if we see, for instance, that someone is always buying stuff from one supplier, or perhaps this is one individual who is storing their Bitcoin in a cold wallet, and they occasionally send some out to a hot wallet, things like this. We can say that they're tainted by each other. But again, most wallets nowadays allow you to trivially create new addresses, so we don't see this as much of a big deal anymore. But we can still do some linking. So for instance, if you remember how we have these inputs and outputs from every transaction, and for instance, I see here that I have coming from 3 different addresses, Bitcoin all going to one UTXO that's 0.4 Bitcoin. Well, there's these input sub 1, sub 2, and sub 3 are probably linked. And if I know any information about those addresses, I might say, oh, they're perhaps all Bill Laboon, or perhaps they are like Bill and his roommates paying their landlord, something like that. So there's evidence that these are linked somehow. And we don't know, like I said, we don't know exactly how just by looking at the data on chain. But if I have it on good authority that input sub 1 belongs to Bill and input sub 3 belongs to Bill from other analysis that I've done, then, well, now I'm going to be able to, with high probability, think that input sub 2 is also related to Bill Laboon, and perhaps I can see, all right, where did that come from, and do more research there. And perhaps now the output, the transaction output, that may also have something to do with me. It's certainly someone that I've interacted with because I interact with them on chain, unless of course somebody stole all my private keys for those inputs. So we can see, looking at this, once you start to get information about someone, then you can get more and more by looking at what they have done on the blockchain. A key thing here, a way that you can avoid that. So in the previous example, we were sending a transaction of 0.4 Bitcoin. And in this transaction, we're going to send, we want to send 0.35 Bitcoin. So we have to send all those inputs, right? We can't take a portion of an input. It has to be entirely spent. And I'm going to send back this 0.05 Bitcoin to a new address, 18J, UTXO sub 1, below. And there's no, I will send the actual payment I'm making to 16C ... UTXO sub 2 to that address. Well, there's, if I had sent back this change address back to one of the previous addresses I've already used, well, now I've just let people know one bit of information about this, that it is in fact a change address. Here, there's no reason. I mean, it would be kind of silly. You'd be paying a little extra in fees to do this, but you could have the actual payment be that 0.05 Bitcoin, UTXO sub 1, and your change address be 0.35. Or they could be payments to two different people. So they may not be any change address there. So again, one of the ways that we can help keep ourselves as anonymous as possible is not reusing addresses, not even for change addresses. Again, most wallets these days will let you do this automatically. So yeah, so as I mentioned, we have an input here on smaller. There's never any way to know if Evil Bill here that sent this input, does he control both of those addresses? Is this just a way to throw people off his trail? Was he spending 0.08 Bitcoin to buy something and getting 0.02 in change? Or was he sending 0.02 Bitcoin to buy something and getting 0.08 in change? So really, if you get anything out of this in terms of increasing your anonymity on Bitcoin, it's avoid address reuse. And you will see this if you go to any site really that accepts Bitcoin for something. It will generate an address for you to use. And that's not just for tracking purposes, although it's also very useful. If you know who is sending you Bitcoin, then you can do something, and you know what address they're going to send it to, you can then do something on that. But anytime you are going to be sending Bitcoin, hopefully it's not something like in the early days people would just post on a forum, like, send me Bitcoin at this address, and that address would never change. Nowadays, we always use different addresses. Address reuse is a terrible thing. And if you're worried about running out of space, there are more addresses possible addresses out there than anyone could possibly use. And with modern wallets, again, it handles all of this, so you don't have to worry about ease of use or anything. It just all happens automatically. So don't reuse addresses. So from the earliest days of Bitcoin, people have wanted to try to de-anonymize those using the system. And what they did, they came up, some of these early Bitcoin de-anonymizers in 2010 and 2011, in the early days, they came up with some idioms of use. That is, how do people use Bitcoin? So we've already mentioned some of these, like shared spending implies a single identity, and that change addresses tend to be fresh addresses. So these new addresses that pop up, they tend to be change addresses. I recommend you look through some of these papers on how de-anonymization happened in the early days, even though much of it, again, we have discovered some ways around it, and I wouldn't say they're out of date per se, but they certainly are looking at an earlier version of Bitcoin than the idioms of use that we have today. But something, again, that still is useful and that they mention, if you can link even part of a cluster of transactions to some real-world identity, well, now you have more information both about that cluster and about the identity. So that real-world identity, well, if you can find out that, all right, Bill Laboon used some Bitcoin here, so not only did I discover information about this Bitcoin, it belongs to Bill Laboon, but I've discovered some information about Bill Laboon. Perhaps I can see when he first started using Bitcoin, or how much Bitcoin he has, what he does with it. So there are a lot of different ways, right? Again, I've already mentioned that buying a coffee, I'm letting people know if I buy it with Bitcoin, who I am. I'm going to have to interface from a particular address with them to send the Bitcoin, perhaps via service providers. So this isn't just like buying something online, but perhaps even your internet service provider. You're sending information about Bitcoin. Perhaps they can capture information about that. Or even just carelessness, like accidentally copying and pasting your address, or even keeping it in your buffer, your copy-paste buffer. That's something that a lot of like that certain JavaScript can read what's in your buffer even before you paste it. So there's a lot of different ways to link this. And as researchers discover better de-anonymization techniques, and the data is going to remain on the Bitcoin network for essentially all time, anonymization tends to get worse over time. So it's sort of a constant battle where we're trying to come up with new features to anonymize and different techniques to do so, and researchers also discover better ways to de-anonymize. So this is from the Coinjoin paper, where we could see actually and determine just based on how Bitcoin moved, and even like by sending perhaps Bitcoin and seeing what happened to it, tracing it, where Bitcoin were ending up and how these different systems were related to each other and how they interacted with each other. And you could see things like Satoshi Dice and Silk Road, My Bitcoin, Bitcoin E, early exchange, InstaWallet, Mt. Gox, another exchange. And we could see, how this all interacted with each other. And once you have that, well, if I know that a certain cluster of Bitcoin or addresses were linked, for instance, to Silk Road, and I'm interested in going after people that use Silk Road, well, I can find their Bitcoin addresses and de-anonymize them, and now I have a good idea of who is using Silk Road. So aside from looking at the chain or looking in person as ways to de-anonymize, we also can use the Bitcoin network itself. So what I mean by this is looking at things at the network. Watching data go from Bitcoin node to Bitcoin node and track down where it came from. So there's a link to a paper on originally how this was done, which is very interesting. We don't think about the nodes as leaking data, but if this is a sort of simplified expression of the Bitcoin network, and we have some spies on it, well, it's kind of like triangulating where an earthquake came from. All right, so here we have the 4 red nodes that are acting as spies, and the blue node issues a transaction. It's going to gossip amongst all the nodes to which it is connected, and you can see it actually is connected to several of our spies. And according to Kaminsky, the first node that informs you of a transaction is probably the source of it. But even if it's not, if we have a good idea of the topology of the network, we can get a better idea of where it came from. So for instance, if our nodes in the United States all see a transaction first and our nodes in Europe and China and Africa all see it later, well, we have a good idea that that transaction probably originated somewhere in the US as opposed to Africa. So in order to avoid this sort of level of de-anonymization, you would have to hide your IP. So there are some ways, like using Tor or similar services. However, that can be blocked. It's very slow. It's not very well suited to running on the Bitcoin network. Because Tor sends data over several hops, it actually might be too slow for using. It's not very easy. But there are some other ways to avoid it. One interesting protocol is Dandelion, which was covered in a paper by Dr. Giulia Fanti from CMU and some others, that basically, just like a dandelion, if you think about a dandelion, has a stem and then a puff ball at the end after it's, when it's reached the end of life, it's got this puff ball at the end that's going to sprout out. So similarly, whenever you issue a transaction, it will randomly send it from node to node. So if we look back here, maybe it sends it from this node to this node to this node to this node, just one by one. So it never moves, it doesn't gossip, it just sends privately to the next node. And then this black node that's highlighted is actually going to be the one that spreads it and gossips it. So for all intents and purposes, for the rest of the network's perspective, the transaction is coming from this node and not the actual originating node. So that's another way of providing some additional anonymity on Bitcoin. You could do offline or off-chain transfers. So these are a little bit more in-depth, but they are possible. OpenDime, I think, is a very interesting way of doing this. It's actually a USB, or the equivalent of like a USB stick. However, the private key is hidden inside of it, and if the Bitcoin is, if you ever actually go to spend it and not just store it, you'll have to basically make an indication that that's happening. So it will actually be physically broken, or in other ways maybe a light would shine or something, so that you would know that this has in fact been used. And no one can, it's not just like copying down a private key to somebody. You give this person an open dime, they are able to verify that there are Bitcoin on it and how much, and then you also can send that data, that Bitcoin on by using up the open dime. So another way to improve anonymity is by using mixers. So if we think back to improving anonymity, we talked about improving the anonymity set, making that larger. So exchanges could be good for this, but they often have their own know your customer or other requirements that hurt your privacy. So there are some dedicated mixing services. So basically what we're doing is we're just making this a larger anonymity set. We're going to all put in our coins, and people are all going to take them out. However, there can be some problems here. So if I want to have, I've got my green avatar here has 0.3 Bitcoin, my furry avatar here has 0.02, and my red-hatted, red napkined avatar has 0.7 Bitcoin. So I send them all into this mixer, and the mixer sends the 0.7 to some other address, which is controlled by the red-hatted person, 0.3 to the green, and 0.02 to the furry one. Well, what's the problem with this? It's trivial for anyone looking at this transaction to determine who actually owns the Bitcoin, right? Because if I send in 0.7 and I receive 0.7, well, it's not going to be hard for people to figure out. I didn't send in 0.7 just to get back 0.02, and I didn't send in 0.02 and think that I'd get back 0.07. So what you'll see with mixers is they'll have a set chunk size. So for instance, this mixer has a 0.1 Bitcoin chunk size. If you want to send in Bitcoin, then you're going to have to put it in chunks of 0.1 Bitcoin. So that way, anyone looking at this, they're not going to be able to tell who the transaction went to, because it's just 0.1 Bitcoin in, 0.1 Bitcoin out. And in case you're curious how many modern mixers actually make money, since they just keep the same amount here, is that a random 1 or 2% of all the outputs will be sent to addresses that they control, and not ones that you control. So it's like paying a 1% fee or a 2% fee. If you have more Bitcoin than the chunk size, you can just send in multiple chunks. So here, the red-hatted bill had 0.2 Bitcoin and passes it in as 2 separate 0.1 Bitcoin transactions, and gets it out here as 2 separate 0.1 Bitcoin addresses, outputs in 2 different addresses. And of course, you can do this over and over again. So Jacket Bill here does a mix and sends it through another mixer and sends it through another mixer. And so each time we're increasing the anonymity set, of the pink arrows that are coming in through it. But of course, there are downsides with using a mixer. First, you're going to need to trust them with your Bitcoin. And because of that, there have been many scams out there where a mixer gets set up and then people send Bitcoin to it and it works fine for a while, and then one day they just keep all the Bitcoin and run away, and there's no way to do anything about it. You also run the risk that someone looking at the history of your Bitcoin is going to say, well, you used a mixer or you got this from a mixer, and so your token is in some sense marked. It's dirty. You are going to need to have a large number of people using the same mixer if you want a large anonymity set. You may see some mixers that they advertise that they have a lot of members, a lot of people using it rather. However, they could just be washing their own Bitcoin multiple times through, which isn't really increasing your anonymity very much. If they have, if we see that there have been 50 addresses sending in 0.1 Bitcoin, but you also see that these same addresses are just using it over and over again, that the Bitcoin goes to address A, that goes to address B, but all of these are just, this all could just be sort of a Sybil attack, right? Or equivalent to Sybil attack is the wrong word, a Sybil scam, that makes you think that the anonymity is much higher than it actually is. And it turns out that mixers don't always follow best practices. It is hard to do in a correct way, and also it's not exactly a field where people are discussing best practices and getting audited and being registered with the government, etc. And so it turns out there are other ways of de-anonymizing those who use mixers. So with all these issues, there is something like a mixer that exists that is used called a Coinjoin. So Coinjoin is interesting. It's like single transaction mixing. So you don't have to worry about having someone else have control of your Bitcoin. So the idea is you find other peers who want to mix, and this would be generally done in an off-chain manner. Exchange input-output addresses, and create a transaction with all of these around it. Right? So you have one really large transaction that sends in a lot of data, a lot of transactions from different addresses, and makes one really big transaction out of it. So this kind of hurts those that are looking to do link analysis, right? Remember we said that generally if data is coming from a transaction, is all included in one transaction, multiple addresses, they are somehow linked. And we are going against that. We're just sort of randomly finding other peers that want to develop this transaction together. Our we weren't linked to them before. Now we're going to send this transaction around, and each peer signs after making sure that their specific output is present. So we've created this transaction, everyone verifies it, and everyone signs it, and then the transaction is broadcast. So basically what we're doing is just making one huge transaction with lots of different people with outputs instead of just a single, all these single transactions that would be easier to track down. But there are some problems with Coinjoin. It's vulnerable to denial of service attacks because someone could, especially with these larger Coinjoins, could decide not to sign midway through. And so it's hard to defend against bad actors in any sort of decentralized way. So there are attempts to do this, but it is something that if someone really wanted to attack, they certainly could by just simply becoming a bad actor in these systems. And with poor implementation, you can leak more data about yourself using this. So those are some of the ways that Bitcoin is trying to, and the Bitcoin ecosystem is trying to improve anonymity. However, because Bitcoin, as I've mentioned, it's a very secure but also very conservative protocol. There are some other coins and blockchains out there that are using different methods to focus on privacy. So some of the more famous ones out there are Zcash, which use ZK snarks, which are zero knowledge proofs. Zcash and some other systems have this as well, an interesting idea of anonymity by choice. So you can sort of sign up for anonymity or not. Monero, which does not have anonymity by choice, simply using it, you are taking advantage of all their anonymity, have some really cool features like ring signatures and stealth addresses, so that your address can actually be different each time, generated anew. Grin and Beam both use the Mimblewimble protocol, which not only is much more private but also much more scalable. And transactions are really of a very different type than what we think of with a Bitcoin style transaction. It allows for really incredible scaling. And we also see privacy enhancements that are being not part of the protocol, but rather that move on top of the protocol, implemented on top of the protocol. So there are several Bitcoin wallets that will allow you to do an automatic coin join. Tornado.cash is really interesting. It's on Ethereum, where you submit your Ether to a big pot, and then you have proof that you can withdraw an equivalent amount at some other time in the future. Aztec is a privacy engine for Ethereum that allows you to obscure what addresses are actually inputting and outputting, or the input and output addresses for a transaction. So this is a really big space, and there is a lot of work being done right now on improving anonymity, and I've really just scratched the surface. So if this at all interests you, I would recommend reading some of the papers that I've linked and looking into all of the different privacy features that are being added and different functionality, because this is a very exciting field right now in blockchain.